Why does so many modern marriages feel like a struggle? Well, today we're going to dive into a couple of sources that offer a really specific diagnosis and, frankly, a pretty controversial blueprint for success. They argue the problem isn't at all what we think it is, and the solution means going back to some very prescribed roles. Okay, let's get into it. Right out of the gate, the sources put this on the table as their core idea. It's not about the usual suspects, finances, bad communication, or just falling out of love. From this point of view, the whole thing starts to crumble when a husband and a wife step away from their distinct, God-given duties. This one idea, it's the foundation for everything else we're about to talk about.
And this is where it gets really intense. The argument in this material is that a marriage doesn't usually collapse from some attack from the outside, but from an internal civil war. See, when these roles are ignored, the home stops being a safe harbor and turns it into a battleground. So what exactly are these roles that they say are so critical?
All right, first up is the husband's role. The sources define this as sacrificial leadership. Let's unpack what they actually mean by that.
Now, what's fascinating here is the specific model the sources use. A husband isn't supposed to be like a CEO or a four-star general. The model is a religious figure who, in their words, didn't come to crush people with power, but to carry their burdens. The entire emphasis is on sacrifice for the good of someone else.
Okay, so if that's the ideal, what does failure look like in the real world? The material is actually very specific on this.
The framework boils it down to three main failures. First, being passive, like Adam in the garden, just standing by silently while everything goes wrong. Second, being harsh, using authority like a weapon instead of a shield. And third, being selfish, putting your own needs and wants first when the role is literally defined by sacrifice.
So here's the crucial link from this perspective. A husband's failure to lead in this specific way doesn't just leave a void. They argue it actively creates the very conditions for the conflict, which brings us to the other side of the equation. So now we turn to the wife's role, which the sources call a call to honor. Now, this is often the most contentious part of this whole framework, so let's see exactly how they define it. The sources are really quick to clarify that their definition of submission isn't about being a doormat or losing your voice. It's presented as an act of trust, the conscious choice to follow a husband's sacrificial leadership. The argument is that it's a response, not just blind obedience. So if that's the ideal, what happens when that trust isn't there, or when that call to honor is actively rejected? Well, the second source we looked at paints a very vivid picture. In this framework, the refusal to honor is described through this portrait of a difficult woman. And she's identified by three key traits: stubbornness, which is a refusal to grow or be corrected; being difficult, basically turning simple interactions into drama; and finally, disrespect, which the sources argue actively sabotages a husband's vision and leadership. And wow, this quote really illustrates the weight the sources place on respect. It's not presented as a nice-to-have. It's framed as absolutely vital, like oxygen. Take it away, the author argues, and you're essentially cutting off his air supply. And the ultimate outcome, according to this view, is that a wife who embodies these traits isn't building a partnership. No, she's creating that internal war we talked about at the very beginning, the one where love is always the first casualty. So why would anyone reject these roles in the first place? The sources point their finger at what they call a cultural diagnosis, the idea that modern society has systematically pitted men and women against each other. And here's the core of that cultural argument. The sources claim that for decades, women were sold this idea that true strength means radical independence from men. At the same time, men were being told that their natural instinct to lead was toxic, that masculinity itself was the problem. And what was the result of all this cultural programming? Well, the sources claim it created an entire generation where men learned to step back, to withdraw, to avoid being criticized, and women learned to fundamentally distrust male leadership. It created the perfect storm for marital failure. So after diagnosing the problem, the sources lay out their proposed solution. They call it the final blueprint. The whole idea is to replace the spirit of competition with a covenant. It's about shifting from asking, so what am I getting out of this, to what is my role and what is my duty? It's about two people playing different but equally important positions on the exact same team. And here it is laid out as clearly as you can get. The husband's role is to lead, and his specific action is sacrificial love. The wife's role is to submit, and her action is wholehearted respect. And according to these texts, these two commands are completely interlocked. One makes the other possible.
And the promised payoff for all this? Well, it's huge. When both partners embrace these prescribed roles, the chaos of that battlefield is replaced by the peace of a refuge. The war at home ends, and the covenant begins.
So, we've unpacked the diagnosis and the blueprint as it's presented in this source material. It proposes a world of covenant over competition, of distinct roles over rivalry. The final question, and we'll just leave this with you, is this. Is this framework a timeless key to a thriving partnership, or is it a relic that no longer fits our modern world?